All right, so chapter 6 begins the skeletal system, which is all about bones. And this particular chapter is titled Bones and Skeletal Tissue. So I'm going to try to go in reasonable consistency with the order of the book, but I will most likely hit topics in slightly different order. That's okay. I'm still going to try to hit as many of the included topics as I can, and I'll try to stay within really consistent order of the book. So the first part of, let me share screen, whiteboard. First part of chapter 6. Oops, let me get my black pen back. It's just easier to see. First part of chapter 6 in your textbook is about cartilage, skeletal cartilage. So I would like you, I'm not going to go back over the 3 types of cartilage, where they're located really and what their characteristics are, because we did that when we studied connective tissue. Just to remind you, the 3 types of cartilage in the human body are hyaline cartilage, which is the most common and serves as articular cartilage, which I'll talk about later. There's also elastic cartilage and fibrocartilage. So please reread. It's just a review, a quick cursory review in chapter 6 at the beginning. But first, I'm going to address the skeleton divisions. And the major divisions of the skeleton are the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. These are the 2 major divisions of the skeletal system. Axial skeleton, think of everything, pretty much almost everything on the midline of the body. So the axial skeleton includes the skull, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. It's called the thoracic cage. You and I call it the rib cage, but technically it's called the thoracic cage, same thing. So the skull, the vertebral column, all the way down to the coccyx, the tailbone, and the thoracic cage are parts of the axial skeleton. Appendicular skeleton is everything else outside of the axial skeleton. This name comes from the word appendage. So it includes our arms and legs all the way out to our fingers and toes, as well as the pectoral girdle, which you and I call the shoulder, and the pelvic girdle that you and I call the hips. So those are the 2 major subdivisions, and I want you to know the constituents of those that I just mentioned, that I just went over. Now I'm going to quickly go through classification of bones, because your book does this at the beginning of the chapter. And I'm going to write in parentheses shape, because these classifications really are based on the shape. Now, different textbooks give slightly different categories and amounts of categories. Your book lists 4 major categories. Some books list 6. I'm just going to do the 4 that your book does. Number 1, long bones. And some of this is just intuitive. You know that some of our bones are long, some of them are short, yada, yada, yada. Long bones, obviously, just like the name says, are longer than they are in any other direction of shape. And they include things, classic examples would be bones like the humerus in the upper arm, the femur in the upper leg, also in the lower arm, the radius in the forearm, the radius in the ulna, in the lower leg, the tibia and fibula. Even our metacarpals and carpal bones, metacarpals and phalanges. So in our hand, the fleshy part of our hand and our fingers are also considered long bones as well. Short bones, just like the name says, it just means they are quite short in their shape. These are the carpals, which are in the wrist. We'll talk more about carpals in the next chapter, in the next unit. Carpal bones, tarsals are ankle bones. You'll learn specific bones of the body in the next section. This chapter 6 is a generic chapter about bones in general, their anatomy, how they function, how they're classified, how they repair, how they grow, that sort of business. Third category based on shape are flat bones. Just like the name suggests, the shape is flat. Classic examples of these would be the scapula, which is what you and I call the shoulder blade, sternum, or you might call that the breastbone. Its scientific name is the sternum. Cranial bones, cranial plates that make up the cranium, top of the head. So I'm just going to write cranial bones are also considered flat. I'm just giving you examples. That's not an exhaustive list. And number 4, the reason your book only gives 4 categories and not 6 is because if a bone doesn't fit into category 1, 2, or 3, your book just classifies it as an irregular bone. So any bone that doesn't fit into category 1, 2, or 3 is considered an irregular bone. Classic examples of that would be vertebrae. We'll study those in detail in the next chapter. Those are in the vertebral column or spinal cord. Pelvic bones, classic example, in the hip. So those are the 4 major classifications based on shape. Now I'm going to go over general functions of the whole skeletal system. So as a system, as an organ system, we're looking at the major functions of the skeletal system. I'm going to quickly scroll to another page so that I have room to write all of these out. I'll try to be fairly brief with this. Support. Skeletal system gives our body support, internal support. The whole reason you can sit up right now, and I can sit up right now, is a combination of functions between the skeletal muscles in our body as well as our bones. So it gives support so that we're not just a gel mass of soft tissue. Protection is a big one. Think of predominantly areas like the skull gives what's inside protection. The thoracic cage gives the organs, our lungs and our heart, protection against damage. Movement. Now, our bones don't themselves move, but they act as levers that our skeletal muscles pull against. So it gives our skeletal muscles something to pull on in order to produce movement in our body. Next one is mineral storage. I'm just going to write specifically calcium and phosphate. There are other minerals. These are the 2 major ones. There are other minerals that are stored in our bones. Also, lipid storage. We do store some fat in our bones. And growth factor. Growth factors, there's more than one. Growth factors that are usually secreted by the liver can be stored in our bones, in the matrix of our bones. Blood cell formation is a big one. Every blood cell that is found in your bloodstream, in the cardiovascular system, is first synthesized in red bone marrow. So blood cell formation, that's got a fancy name that you need to learn now, called hemopoiesis. Hormone production is the last one on the list. The bones are not a major source of hormones, but they do produce, in particular, a hormone called osteocalcin. That regulates insulin secretion, which affects bone formation. So those are the major cursory functions of the skeletal system as a whole. Now we're going to look at bone structure. Just think the anatomy of typical bones. Sorry, anatomy, let me get that spelled right. So from our connective tissue discussion a while back, we did identify that there are two major types of bone tissue, compact bone and spongy bone. I mentioned those during our connective tissue discussion. We are going to examine those a little bit more deeply in this chapter. So compact bone, I'll examine that in detail in a little while, but this is very hard and dense. Spongy bone, just to remind you, is made up of these tiny little bone spicules or needles. And we find red marrow between those bone spicules. So I'm going to put with red marrow. All right, I wanted to remind you of those two different types of tissue before I get into specific bone anatomy. So just to save space, I usually do this second, but I'm going to do it first because I have a narrow, flat space down here. So I'm going to draw a flat bone. If we cut open a flat bone, say the scapula, the shoulder blade, or a cranial plate, what we find is that most flat bones have a sandwich looking, if we slice them open and look at the inside, most flat bones have a sandwich looking anatomy in which there is compact bone surrounding the outside of this sandwich, and it's dense and hard. And then inside of flat bone, we find spongy bone. How much depends on the location in the body. For example, in the pelvis, the ilium of the pelvis, your hip bone, that flat bone is filled with a lot of spongy bone and red marrow. Other flat bones have this to a degree, but some more and some less. So there's the spongy bone in the center. And then in the spaces of these little bone needles or spicules is red bone marrow, okay? This sandwich-like arrangement has it's a French name, it's called diploé. And that literally just means a sandwich-like anatomical arrangement. So I'm just going to write sandwich, in which compact bone surrounds that spongy bone. A typical long bone anatomy is a little bit more sophisticated. So let me draw a long bone. I'm going to purposefully make this very wide and thick for a reason, because I need to fit a lot of stuff inside of it. So there's like a generic humerus we find in the upper arm. Obviously, this is short and wide because of my restrictions of my iPad. I'm going to go through structural elements of this typical long bone. And a lot of this is just learning the language. If you can master the language of this, which I will be using throughout this whole section and into the next, you'll be better off. So I'm going to write that sort of a glossary over here and explain them as I write them. The word diaphysis, D-I-A-P-H-Y-S-I-S, that just means the shaft of a long bone. So let's do this. Let's number these. The diaphysis would be the shaft of this long bone from here to here. So that's number one. The word epiphysis, they're funky words, but they're not complicated terms in meaning. Epiphysis means the end of a long bone. So an epiphysis would be here and here. And plural, we would say epiphyses. That would mean more than one. Epiphysis is singular. Diaphysis is usually singular all the time because a long bone typically only has one shaft. So we also use the language proximal and distal, which is why I wanted you to learn some of that anatomy language in chapter 1. A proximal epiphysis would be the end of a long bone that's closer to the body. A distal epiphysis is the end of that bone that's further away from the body. So when I hold my arm out straight, my humerus is my upper arm bone. This part would be the proximal epiphysis up at my shoulder. This would be the distal epiphysis down at my elbow. So that's just getting used to some language, okay? Next on the list, I don't use this word a whole lot, but your book does, and it's worth saying. Metaphysis is just the area between number 1 and 2. So it's sort of the neck of this long bone. There's a metaphysis there. There's also a metaphysis in this area. Number 4 is the medullary cavity. Our bones, our long bones, are not solid all the way through. They actually look like this. There's a space in here. It's not hollow, but there's a space, and we call that the medullary cavity. In infants, newborns, the medullary cavity is filled with red marrow. So I'm going to write red marrow because it is a site of blood cell synthesis in infants. In adults like you and me, it's filled with yellow marrow, which is fat. It's lipid tissue. So once we become pretty much fully grown, all during adolescence and puberty, that red marrow gets converted to yellow marrow, and rather than being a red blood cell synthesis site, it becomes a site for lipid storage or fat storage. Number 5, I'm going to write epiphyseal line on the surface of our long bones. If you were to just take a bone, if we were in lab right now in person, and I was teaching in person, and I wish I was, we would have bones laid out on the table. You would see a scar or a remnant right in this metaphysis area. Just looks like a line or a scar on the bone. Sometimes we can see it on both ends. That is where a growth plate once existed when we were young. After we're fully grown, that growth plate fuses, and the epiphyseal line is just a remnant or a scar from where that growth plate was. Number 6, I'm just going to write this and explain it. Epiphyseal plate just means growth plate, okay? So when we're young, we have an epiphyseal plate, which is cartilage, in that area of the metaphysis. After we finish growing physically, that plate fuses bone on bone, and we get an epiphyseal line. 7, I'm writing nutrient artery. Most bones, particularly long bones, have a main blood supply that comes in right about the diaphysis, middle of the diaphysis area. And it enters the bone and then branches, subdivides. That main artery is called the nutrient artery. That supplies blood vascularization to this bone tissue. Now, there are also major arteries that supply this area, but they're not quite as big as this area. They're also considered nutrient arteries, but they're not the main one for that particular bone. Number 8, the periosteum. Peri, P-E-R-I, means around. Osteum means bone. So this is tough, coarse, fibrous connective tissue that is like a jacket surrounding mostly the diaphysis of a typical long bone like this. It's tough fibers. If we were to reach into a live person's arm like Indiana Jones and rip out their bone, it wouldn't be all nice and perfectly white and clean like the bones that we have in lab or you see on skeletal models. You would see all of these blood vessels and nerves going into the bone as well. You'd also see this tough, coarse connective tissue that's literally stuck to the bone with these little connective collagen fibers like this, penetrate the bone surface to keep it secure. I'll talk about all the functions of this periosteum a little later. I just want you to know what it is. Also, there is something called the endosteum. Peri means around, endo means within. Endosteum is not tough, fibrous connective tissue. It's thin, delicate connective tissue that lines the inside of the medullary cavity. So I'm just going to put yellow. It's a thin, clear, delicate connective tissue on the inside of the medullary cavity. Number 10, I'm writing articular cartilage. To articulate means where bone meets bone at a joint and there's movement. Articular cartilage is hyaline cartilage, that's the type of tissue it is, that covers the ends, particularly of long bones, but it usually covers the surface of a bone wherever there's a joint where it articulates with another bone. That's why it's called articular cartilage. Remember, it's hyaline cartilage, not elastic cartilage, not fibrocartilage. It provides this glassy, smooth surface. So when this bone is articulating with another bone, we don't have bone grinding on bone. We have smooth, glassy cartilage touching smooth, glassy cartilage on the other bone. Almost finished. Number 11, I'm writing trabeculi. Remember we said that this material in the shaft of a long bone is compact bone. It's hard and dense. And we said the ends of long bones, as well as the middle of flat bones, is typically spongy bone. That's what I'm drawing now. And there's red marrow in these spaces. This is an adult bone, by the way. If it was an infant's bone, a newborn's bone, there would also be red marrow going down into the medullary cavity. But think it's an adult bone, and so there's fat or lipids stored in there. Anyway, this spongy bone that we find in the epiphyses, the ends of long bones, those little bone needles or struts or spicules are called trabeculi. I'll go into detail about how spongy bone functions a little bit later. So that rounds out my major drawing. This is all in your textbook, but it helps us get a glossary, a language going, so that when I say things like epiphyseal plates or diaphysis or periosteum or endosteum, get used to that language, okay? Really quickly, I'm going to go to a new page, and I'm going to list some functions of that periosteum. Remember, what is the periosteum? Periosteum. It is a coarse, sort of dense, connective tissue found wrapping the outside of either the diaphysis of a long bone. Sometimes we find some periosteal tissue around the outside of a flat bone as well. So it's mostly dense, irregular connective tissue. we find osteogenic cells. These are stem cells, by the way, on the inner surface of the periosteum. So just on the outside surface of real bone tissue. And these osteogenic stem cells, they give rise to new bone. Also, the periosteum is very rich in vascularization and nerves. So it's where blood vessels enter and exit the bone tissue. It's also where nerves enter and exit the bone tissue. This word, nutrient foramina, oops, let me get the spelling correctly for you. It's F-O-R-A-M-I-N-A. Foramen means hole. Foramina means small hole. So a nutrient foramina is just a hole where the nutrient artery enters both the periosteum and the bone tissue itself. Sharpie's fiber, it's a funny name. Sharpie's fibers are those little connective tissue spicules that I drew on my periosteum penetrating the bone surface. They're like these little needles that penetrate the surface of the bone, not very deep, but they help grab the bone and keep the periosteum secured. Also, the periosteum provides an anchoring site for tendons and ligaments. Just to remind you, we said this when we studied connective tissue. Tendons are connection points of muscle to bone. Ligaments are connective tissue that connects bone to bone. The periosteum oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes serves as an anchoring site for those tendons and ligaments. Now I'm going to say a few things about red marrow. I think I said this verbally, but I'm just going to jot down a few things. We call red marrow hematopoietic tissue because we just said hematopoiesis, it means the synthesis of red blood cells. So that gel-like tissue, it's soft, and I'm just going to write gel-like, is the site of all blood cell production. That means red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. It's found in the spaces between the trabeculi and spongy bone. I don't have time in this discussion, this mini lecture, to go through all of the terms in table 6.1. I'm going to just tell you, please use it as a resource for vocabulary. I may just ask you a few questions on the next quiz from that table, not many, but I will use the language all the time in the next unit when we study actual bones. What it is a table identifying bone markings. So I'm just going to tell you what that means. And then I would get to know that table while we do this unit, and specifically use it a lot when we do the next unit. I think that's chapter 7 and 8. What bone markings are just things on the surface of a bone, and they all have names. For example, if there's a hole penetrating through a bone that, say, a nerve or an artery needs to penetrate, that's a foramen, or foramen. Bones also have narrow, slender, long projections called crests. A trochanter is a big blunt projection. A tubercle is a smaller pointy projection. So all of these names have meanings, and they're just, I'm going to write bone surface markings. I'm just going to give you some examples. Are things like holes, crests, protrusions, we'll say ... All of those bumps and indentations have names. So I want you to go over table 6.1. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of living bone cell tissue. It is a living, highly vascularized tissue. There's lots of blood supply. We identified that back when we studied connective tissues. So just remember, bone is a connective tissue, so there's living cells in there as well as a non-living matrix. That non-living matrix is the hard stuff. I'll describe to you how the matrix is formed in great detail, so don't worry about that yet. But where we store those minerals, that calcium and phosphates, is the large component of that non-living matrix. Let's first go over the living cells we find in bone. I'm going to list these, and I'm going to say detailed information about each one. We already mentioned osteogenic cells. They're stem cells. Some books also call those osteoprogenitor cells. Same thing. Sort of depends on which book you're reading. These are stem cells. That means they're actively dividing. They give rise to new cells. That's what stem cell means. And the type of cellular division that goes on at stem cells is called mitosis. We find these osteogenic stem cells, we said, underneath the periosteum, on the bone side of the periosteum, as well as under the endosteum at the medullary cavity. So that's the location of where we find most of these osteogenic cells. These tend to be flat cells mostly because of their location on the surface and on the inside of bone tissue. So we call them squamous cells because they're flat in shape, and they constantly divide to give rise to osteoblasts. Give rise to those immature bone cells called osteoblasts. They also give rise to bone lining cells, L-I-N-I-N-G. So let's go over some of these other cells, like, for example, osteoblasts. You know what blast means from our first unit. A blast cell, or from probably the connective tissue unit, a blast cell is an immature that secretes usually some component of the non-living matrix. So this is immature, and it secretes something called osteoid. Osteoid is the organic component of bone matrix. I'll talk more about that when we talk about bone formation. Okay, it's really just calcium binding proteins, collagen fibers. That's what the organic component of bone matrix is. They also play a role in matrix calcification. You'll get to know what I mean by the end of this chapter, because I'm going to talk about new bone formation quite often. So when they completely, I'm going to show you what they do. Here's an osteoblast, an immature bone cell. And there it is. When it's young, it secretes this sort of organic goo called osteoid. That's made up of collagen fibers. It's made up of collagen fibers, binding proteins, and it secretes this stuff. Blood in the nearby area coming through this area, there's a blood vessel, carries calcium in it. Blood deposits calcium in the area of the osteoid. And this osteoid then sort of grabs the calcium mineral and calcifies this stuff, hardens it. So the calcium acts like a hardener, like an epoxy hardener. So the osteoid is like this sort of gel-like goo that's secreted. When calcium is deposited in this area, there are binding proteins that bind the calcium. And that's what makes our bone tissue really hard, is the combination of osteoid and calcium. When these osteoblasts have completely buried themselves in new bone matrix, hard bone matrix, they stop secreting and they become a mature bone cell called an osteocyte. So an osteocyte was once an osteoblast that is now mature. It no longer secretes osteoid. And its job as an adult bone cell or mature bone cell is to maintain that bone matrix. That it once secreted. So maintaining, I'll talk about that. What they do is once they're mature is they can communicate with other bone cells, as well as they chemically communicate with nutrient exchange between the blood and other bone cells. Now, what are those bone lining cells that we mentioned above? Bone lining cells are flat, so they're squamous shaped as well, and they're found on the surface of bone tissue where active remodeling, that means making new bone and taking away old bone, where active remodeling is not going on. I'm just going to say is not taking place. These are also called periosteal cells and endosteal cells because we also find them under the periosteum and the endosteum. They help maintain matrix. They don't necessarily make new bone or remove old bone. They maintain bone matrix in conjunction with those osteocytes. Finally, number 5, I'm going to start it here so I don't run out of space. Osteoclasts. Before I go any further, osteoblasts, which become osteocytes, and bone lining cells are all synthesized by these osteogenic stem cells. Osteoclasts are not synthesized by osteogenic stem cells. So their derivation, where they come from, is a much different place. These are derived from macrophages, which are basically a modified white blood cell. They're immune cells. So to give you a brief history, macrophages are immune cells that are modified monocytes. I know this is a lot of new language to some of you. Monocytes are just a type of white blood cell. Those are made in the red bone marrow with all blood cells. Monocytes, like other white blood cells, then get released into our blood. Specific monocytes that migrate out of our bloodstream and into our tissues and other fluids become macrophages, which are immune cells. Then specific macrophages are called up to become osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are a type of living bone cell that we find in bone tissue. What they do is they dissolve bone matrix. That's their key function. So these cells, osteoblasts, make new bone matrix. These cells, osteoclasts, dissolve bone matrix. How they dissolve bone matrix is they release digestive enzymes and acids that literally break down bone matrix. Why would we want to degrade or break down bone matrix? That's a key point that we need to understand in this whole chapter. The main reason we have so much calcium stored in our bones, over 99% of the calcium we ingest is eventually stored in our bones, is because calcium is the most used mineral in the human body. Every time a muscle contracts, calcium is necessary. Every time your heart beats, calcium is necessary. Every time a nerve cell fires an impulse or communicates with another nerve cell, calcium is used. So we need so much calcium, and we store over 99% of it in our bones so that we have a ready supply should we not be able to ingest it. So when we build up new bone, what we're doing is we're storing calcium. When we dissolve old bone matrix, what we're doing is we're breaking down the bone tissue so that calcium can be released into our bloodstream. So the calcium in our bones, here's a bone. The matrix is filled with stored calcium. The calcium that our muscles and our heart and our nerve cells can use is in our blood. That's where our usable calcium is. We don't have very much of it in our blood. If we need to get calcium out of this storage area and use it, put it into the bloodstream for use, these cells are able to do that. They break down the bone matrix to release that calcium into the blood. Before we leave today, I want to review the difference between compact bone structure and spongy bone structure. Oops, let's go to black pen. So we're going to learn how compact bone, that dense, hard bone tissue, is arranged. I'm going to draw pictures and explain to you. If we take a bone, let's just say really quickly, for example, if I take this bone that I've drawn and I slice it right across here, and then we look at the inside of that bone, that's what I'm going to draw on this page. So we've sliced that long bone on its diaphysis in its shaft, and it looks like this. Somewhat, it's not a perfect circle, but it's circular in the shaft. In the middle is the medullary cavity. In an adult, that would be filled with lipid or fat called yellow marrow. So I'm just going to write medullary cavity filled with yellow marrow. All of this stuff out here is hard bone matrix. That's what we're going to examine right now. It's not just a bunch of nothing. It's actually a living, growing tissue. So I'm going to erase these. If we were to look at that tissue, that hard tissue, under a microscope, I'm going to draw for you, what we would see is that this bone, we would see these ring-like units like this. I'm not going to go around and fill up the whole bone. They're not perfect circles, but they're somewhat circular. And this is magnified under a microscope. So we see these little outlines. And then in the center of one of these rings is a hole. And that tunnel runs parallel to this medullary cavity. Okay. One of these ring units of bone growth is called an osteon. So it's a unit of compact bone growth. In the center of each osteon is a central canal, sometimes called a haversian canal. And that canal is not, it's way smaller than this medullary cavity, but it runs parallel to it. Rather than filled with marrow, that haversian canal has blood vessels in it and nerves. Now I'm going to magnify one of those osteon units. So I'm going to take one of these, this osteon right here, and I'm going to magnify it. It's not a bone, it's just one bone growth unit, an osteon. In the center of it, there's the haversian or central canal. It's got arteries, veins, nerves inside of it. It also has living bone cells in the tissue. So because this is an already formed bone, I'm going to draw these little pockets or cavities. And they encircle the haversian canal. And they create this ring-like pattern. These little caves or cavities have a name. And inside of each one of them is a living cell, an osteocyte. So I'm going to put a living cell, a mature bone cell, an osteocyte in each of these little pockets. And I'll label it for you. This would be an osteocyte inside of a lacuna. We know what an osteocyte is. It's a mature bone cell. A lacuna is the little pocket or cavity that it resides in, that it lives in. It's a little space. At one time, that osteocyte was an osteoblast, and it secreted that hard matrix that it's now encased in. But it lives in this little pocket or cavity, and there are little tiny canals that connect these lacunae, that's plural. So you can see this thing starts to look like growth rings of a tree. Those little canals or lines are called canaliculi. And that just means it's Latin for small canal. Canaliculus is singular, it means one. If I were to put an I at the end of this instead of a US, that just means more than one. So canaliculi, I'm going to point to two of them, are just small, tiny canals that provide for a communication route or pathway for things like nutrients, waste products, tiny nerves, tiny vessels to get through. Now, these vessels that run arteries and veins, they also branch out through what we call perforating canals to supply nutrition to these living cells. The ring-like growth pattern, it sounds like lacuna, but it's not. The word, let me get my black pen back. The word lamella, with an E at the end is plural. Lamellae refers to growth ring patterns of compact bone matrix. So we know what an osteon is. Sorry. We know what an osteon is. We've defined that. We've defined lamella. I'm just doing a checklist so that you have all the vocabulary. We've defined central canal with arteries, veins, and nerves inside of the osteon. We've defined a perforating canal of these arteries and veins branching outward. A lacuna is a pocket or cavity that an osteocyte or living cell resides in. A canaliculi or canaliculus is a small canal that allows for a communication port or route between those osteocytes. The last term I'm going to write is interstitial lamellae. We know what lamellae are. They're patterns of growth ring of compact bone. Interstitial lamellae just means this. These growth rings, these osteons that I've drawn out here, do not perfectly line up all the time. In other words, this osteon might do something like this, and there's a space. We color this interstitial lamellae. There's a space in here. It's not a hollow space. It fills in with hard bone matrix. That would be interstitial lamellae. Now let's look at spongy bone before we call this lecture a day. This is compact bone and how compact bone grows, all right? Last topic, let's look at spongy bone. Spongy bone is different. The structure of it is different. You know, just from what little you know, you probably have recognized the differences already. Spongy bone has trabeculi, which we've defined as those tiny bone struts or spicules. I think of them as because they look like little bone needles. These are tiny bone spicules, and they look like they're randomly arranged if we were to slice open a bone and look at these, but they're not, technically they're not randomly arranged. They are arranged specifically to resist the stress of force, of physical force put on the end of that long bone. They appear sort of like diagonal branches or branches of a thorny bush. There are no osteons, those growth ring patterns, in spongy bone. There's just a thin layer of lamellar bone tissue on the outside of those little bone needles. There are osteocytes so now I'm going to try to draw these. I'm going to magnify these trabeculi, make them really big. And we see them, they appear to be randomly arranged, even though they are not. So what I'm doing is I'm just magnifying these tiny bone needles or struts. We do find living cells in these branches. They're osteocytes living in lacunae, but we don't get those growth ring-like patterns. We don't get those units of bone growth. Let's do this. And they're so thin that bone tissue is relatively thin here. So the cells, the osteocytes that are living in these lacunae, are very close to the surface. I've drawn them on the surface. That's technically you couldn't see them from the surface, but they're right underneath the surface of a really super micro thin layer of lamellar bone tissue, of a calcified bone. In the spaces, we know there's red marrow. Red marrow is made up of a lot of just meandering capillaries, small blood vessels. everywhere. I'm not going to pack this in. It would take me too long. So the red marrow, we have lots of blood vessels, capillaries, and this soft gel-like material full of stem cells. This capillary network brings nutrition to these osteocytes in their lacunae. And they're so close to the surface. In other words, these vessels are in such close proximity to these cells that direct exchange can occur between the blood and these bone cells in spongy bone. So they appear like diagonal branches. We know that there's no osteons present. It's just a thin layer of compact bone with osteocytes inside of those trabeculi. They are connected by canaliculi as well. So I'm going to draw those. So they can communicate with each other, exchange nutrients and gases, whatnot with each other. On top of that thin layer of bone is a layer of endosteal tissue. So there's this thin, super micro thin layer of clear connective tissue in which we find osteogenic cells, stem cells. So I'll just label this endosteum. So the endosteum, that thin, super thin, delicate connective tissue, lines the medullary cavity of a typical long bone. It also covers the surfaces of trabeculi in spongy bone. I know I said that was the last topic, so I'm going to stop there. Let me cut my recording